Hi, I'm Josette Sheeran. I'm President and CEO here at Asia Society. It's great to see new and old friends, but many heroes in this room, heroes of mine, heroes of many of the children around the world who have better opportunities because of you. I always love this time of year, at least in the U.S. It's when school started, and you'd get your new little pencil box. And at least when I was growing up, you got to pick one new outfit every year. It was for school, and it was so exciting. And here in New York, it's the time when the whole world comes together and tries to do good things together. I was reflecting on the honor of being asked to open by our head of our global education work, Tony Jackson, Dr. Tony Jackson, the amazing Dr. Tony Jackson. And was reflecting back to being on the staff of the president in the year 2000, and the MDGs were being created. And the big debate about what were the 5 most important things and how to do it. And it was the first time there'd ever be a template for the world to all say, these are the priorities. And education was number 2. Primary education, and that kind of breakthrough, because at least for a long time, education was viewed as, totally just the purview of nations, and there was nothing to really talk about. And in the U.S., it's very localized. And I think, as Wendy Kopp has discovered or knew, local communities really do have to own education, but the power also of putting this up on a global stage. And wow, I was reflecting on how far we've come in that short time. And also the new SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, really this report that's being launched today is based on SDG 4. And rereading that and the new texture in there, and this emphasis on lifelong learning and the quality of learning. So it's not just the quantity and just the big effort to increase, the number of schools and access to schools, but all of that. So at least for me, this gathering, these types of gatherings, I actually get emotional because I just remember how far we've come. And this report was, is so important, the work you've been doing to dive in and really help figure out what is the pathway forward to really share the knowledge and share what's important. So, I want to say for Asia Society, I was so proud when I joined Asia Society 5 years ago to discover the deep work that had been happening here for well over a decade by Dr. Jackson and his team, Alexis Menton, where are you? Kate Farmer, Neelam, all of you, just raise your hands because you're amazing. By Tony Jackson's own story, growing up in South Central LA, getting bused to a white school and realizing, wow, there's something called education. It's not what I've been experiencing in my neighborhood. And deciding to devote his life to providing that kind of access to all children and the skills needed to succeed. And so his doctoral work at the University of Michigan in the late 80s, really looking at what are the core competencies. So I'm so proud of that work, but also the Global Cities Education Network that this institution had put together to say, what's the future of education? Let's connect with the most successful communities in the world in education, the Singapores and the Shanghais and Torontos and Switzerland, others that were pace setting, and share best practices. And that network has done things like help transform teacher education in places like Denver and elsewhere. So that idea that, we need to connect the best thinkers in the world together. So I think this moment now, at least for us, takes those original partnerships and our ongoing partnerships with the OECD and UNESCO and Harvard and Stanford and those cities, Gates Foundation, Carnegie Corporation, and others, into the networks that all of you have built together, and the incredible work by Gordon Brown, one of my great mentors, and Sarah Brown in this area, and all of you. We know from the Education Commission's 2016 Learning Generation Report that this work still has a long way to go. And in fact, if we look at the trajectory that we're on, we're not on track. By 2030, over 800 million children and young people will still not have the basic skills or qualifications for the modern workforce. This is, to me, about global stability. It is, to me, about global opportunity. It's about everything. It's not disconnected. It's not a side project. This is the core project that, when we read the headlines today, the lack of ability for the rising generation to connect with the skills needed today and the competencies needed today is very much the work of the presidents and prime ministers and leaders of the world to get right. As this commission outlined, to accelerate progress in education, we need to invest in this cross-border learning and sharing, and by developing the infrastructure needed to share the knowledge across borders, best practices and innovations, and then this can come to new geographies and create the kind of global collaborations that can propel everyone forward. With support of the Commission, the co-conveners are here today, so I just want to recognize them, along with Asia Society, the Boston Consulting Group. How are you? Here you are. Results for Development, Teach for All, the World Innovation Summit for Education, WISE, and have I said Results for Development? Yeah, everybody. I want to make sure we get full credit in there. And the work you've done to define a framework which will improve this knowledge across all borders. As a result, today we are launching a new report, Investing in Knowledge Sharing to Advance SDG 4, based on a consultative process that involved over 200 education stakeholders, including governments, bilateral and multilateral funders, UN institutions, foundations, and private and civil society organizations. Before we dive in, I'd like to extend a special welcome to the Education Commissioners in attendance and acknowledge their vision and leadership that's brought us here. So we have Juho Lee. There you are. Welcome. Who also serves on our advisory board for the Center for Global Education here. Baela Raza Jamil, thank you, from Pakistan. And Amel Karboul, thank you. Also a special welcome to Manas Antoninas, how are you? From UNESCO, a great partner to all of us on this, and who's written extensively on this topic and provided significant feedback to the co-authors through a peer review. I'm sure the report's better thanks to your input. And copy of the Global Education Monitoring Report, which you oversee, will be in the back of the room at the end of this on the global public goods in education. We'd also like to welcome all of our speakers and panelists and give everyone a quick preview of today's program. So first, you're going to hear from Liesbet Steer, Director of the Education Commission, a great partner to all of us, with thoughts on setting the tone for the important work that's been done here. So great to see you. And then Lane McBride from the Boston Consulting Group will present an overview. And following that, the amazing Wendy Kopp will lead a panel discussion on the topic of knowledge sharing with Eliza Erikson from Omidyar Network, and also Randa Grob-Zakhary from the board of the Global Partnership for Education, and Baela, who I introduced earlier, and Brodie Vansleve from BHP Foundation. And then Amel, who I introduced earlier, will offer closing remarks. And then, after the program concludes, join us for a continuation of the conversation over reception. And my thanks to all of you. I had an amazing discovery this morning. I wear a second hat as the UN Special Envoy for Haiti. I theoretically get paid $1 a year for that. I haven't seen it. You spend a lot of time in a country like Haiti and you realize education is the missing link for transformation. Wendy was just telling me about the amazing work happening there. I love this revolution you're leading. I will be your supporter. I will ask for funders to back it because there's no more important work. And with that, Liesbet, could you come and start us off?
Good morning. Thank you so much, Josette, for this wonderful introduction, and thank you for Asia Society as well to host us here today and bring us all together, give us a wonderful walk up from downtown that really set us off very well for this week. I'd like to also thank the organizations who worked together on this report. This was a great collaborative effort between the organizations that were just mentioned, and that's really wonderful to see. So, as Josette mentioned, in 2016, the Education Commission released its report called The Learning Generation. And in that report, there were 12 recommendations, and we were quite precise about it. And one of them was around the need for greater knowledge sharing and the need to build what we called an ecosystem for education knowledge. Why did we make this recommendation? The Commission was set up to reinvigorate the case for investment in education and to chart a pathway forward to make greater progress. It was at a time when actually a lot of people were sort of checking out. In 2015, and UNESCO actually did a great job calling people out, saying, look, investment in education is actually falling. It was 6-7 years. Last year, luckily, we have a sort of re-entry of some of the donors, but it was a moment in time where we felt education was losing ground. A lot of other sectors, climate change, health, they were all out there convincing people that this was the most important topic. Now, the background research that we did for the Commission's report highlighted a critical lack of investment in global public goods and education. And this may be part of the reason why we were failing to make a successful case for investment in education, and why, despite great effort, we were left with half of the world's population not even ready to enter the workforce. So it was estimated that only 3% of overseas development assistance was spent on global public goods, while in health it's more than 20%. And the World Bank and UNESCO made it really clear what that actually means. It means that in half of the low-income countries, we don't have learning assessments. It means that for over half of all the indicators that we're supposed to be tracking for the SDGs, more than half of the countries don't even have indicators. So we really have a lack of knowledge to guide us forward. So we also found that there was a lot of sort of collection of data and gathering, but actually as a community we were not hanging together. There was too much fragmentation, too many things done in silos. So that needed to change as well. So we said, let's call for greater investment in these global public goods within existing institutions and beyond, and also create a vision for this. And we all know that good data and good research is great to help us be more effective. But what this report does is actually say it's not enough. We always think about the next great report and the next great data set we might be, at least as researchers we do. But that's not enough. We need to actually invest on something that's like an infrastructure. We need to think about a supporting infrastructure that consists of certain elements. And that is what this report is actually laying out. It's really trying to look at sort of what are these elements, these ingredients for an effective infrastructure for knowledge creation and knowledge sharing. So when you hear this framework today, you may think, maybe some of this sounds obvious. But I really call upon all of us to actually think about, are we implementing the obvious? Are we actually doing what this is setting out? And as a commission, we are asking ourselves this question as well. We ask ourselves this question about even the Learning Generation report. We put a great report out there. Are we doing enough to make sure that the knowledge in there takes hold and that we can work on that? We do it on our Education Workforce Initiative. And when we did our own self-evaluation, we actually found a few areas for improvement. And so I really hope that all of us can look at this and say, well, actually, this could be quite useful if we're very sort of deliberate about looking at these different components and see whether we are doing enough to invest in them. So there's been a lot of momentum over the past year, and I really look forward to continuing working with you on making this vision of a learning generation a reality, of making the vision of an SDG 4 a reality, and working together to create this ecosystem of knowledge and sharing knowledge. So I'd like to introduce Lane McBride, a partner at the Boston Consulting Group and one of the leaders of this report and the education practice, to present the key findings of the report on behalf of the co-authors. Thank you.
Okay. Good morning. So first of all, I'd like to thank Liesbet and the education commissioners who are here and the education commission staff, obviously for the Learning Generation report and the inspiration. I mean, you've really teed this up beautifully in your introduction today, but also for your support and engagement over the past 16 months as this report has been developed. And the same actually to many others in this room who are familiar faces from the past months. So as Liesbet said, there was a particular recommendation in the Learning Generation report that we refer back to. And it's this one here on the screen about a global ecosystem for cross-border learning and sharing. And really it was the whole aim of the past 16 months effort to take the research and that recommendation to the next step, to have additional engagement to get to the next level of depth. And Liesbet also mentioned this. One of the data points that really animated this discussion for us, and really, for those of you who were here for our working session at Asia Society a year ago, we talked about this data point, was this one. 21% of ODA in health goes to global public goods, and the number is only 3% of a smaller pie in education. But we had to ask the critical question of, well, is there something different about health from education that actually explains this? Maybe this is how it should be. And part of that question was thinking about some of the most successful global public goods in health. Vaccines, insecticide-treated bed nets, and maybe it's true. Maybe there is not any equivalent of that in education. So we really challenged ourselves to look first outside of the education sector at where are there examples of global public goods that need to support complex behavioral change sustained over time. But we found some. So I'll speak to a couple of examples, which of course we go into more depth on in the report. So the first is the CGIAR. So as many of you know, CGIAR is a network of research for development centers in the agriculture sector. There are 15 of them. They're mostly in the global south. And some of the results that you hear most prominently for CGIAR are actually some that sound a little bit more like the vaccine side of the global public goods. Their work on crop productivity, for example, there's research that shows that they have a 9x return on their work over decades to make crop yields more productive. But they do a lot of other work too, and as we dug in, we found examples like the one from Bangladesh you can see about on the screen, where their work in policy and their work in economic development and agriculture communities has borne similarly substantial results. And that, we thought, maybe a better analog for many of the types of public goods, the types of knowledge exchange that we see in education. Another example that we looked at, that you also can read about in the report, is the Joint Learning Network. So this comes from the health sector. Started in 2010 with 6 countries participating. It's a network focused on moving in the direction of universal health coverage. And what we found, admittedly a bit more nascent than the long-standing results you see associated with something like vaccines, but very positive. So first of all, the growth from 6 to 30 countries participating. And we also found that the vast majority of those participating in the Joint Learning Network report that they're making changes in their countries as a direct result of being part of the network. So these examples give us, really some hope and some reason to look into this more deeply. And so now I'll talk a little bit more about what we found within the education sector. As Liesbet alluded to, this is the product of work over a series of 16, 17 months, over 200 stakeholder discussions, some working sessions that many of you have participated in, a review of existing literature, and really diving deep in some case studies. Both within the education sector and outside. And so what did we find? Well, first of all, there's a lot of energy in the education sector around global public goods. There's a lot of belief, and there are a lot of emerging examples of global public goods that have had an impact and can have an impact. Liesbet referred to some examples, globally comparable data, to tools that represent practices that were effective in one place and can be used in other places, to research that demonstrates interventions and programs that are having an impact. But almost as universally as we found enthusiasm and examples of global public goods that were making a difference or had the promise to make a difference were the cautionary tales. The data set that was meticulously collected and never used. The tool that seemed great when it was put together inside of a global organization, but was wholly impractical when it reached practitioners on the ground. The case studies that were written and sat in some back corner of the internet, vastly underappreciated. And if the story stopped there, it would be somewhat bleak. But the examples that we heard that were more promising had a couple of additional components, and that creates the framework on the screen. So first was capacity development. When we heard about global public goods that were successful, we heard about them being accompanied by support, and this support could be provided by a local, national, regional, or global actor, support to contextualize it, to take it from one context to another, and to build the capacity of those at all levels who are needed to implement and use the public good for good in a new context. And then the other thing we heard about a lot was networks. Networks have several advantages vis-a-vis global public goods. One is that they can enable them to be customized. When you have a network that's engaged from early on, so they can enable the creation of a global public good that actually works in different local contexts. Another advantage is that after a global public good exists, networks can enable faster implementation at scale and can enable the concurrent learning by multiple geographies implementing something at the same time so that they can learn not only from their own experiences but from each other. And so this model showed up again and again in slightly different forms in the more positive examples of global public goods that we found. And so now I'm going to talk about one example. And this example, so this is Education Commissioner Baela Raza Jamil's example. Her organization, ITA in Pakistan, has spearheaded this work. So I am not the expert on this. She is. And the good news is she'll be on the panel in just a minute and can talk more about it. But this is the example of Chala Parho Barho and out-of-school children in Pakistan. So in 2011, Pakistan had over 12 million out-of-school children, largest rate in South Asia. And what you might expect would happen, and what happens in many examples in the education sector, is that Baela and her team may have created something new to address this challenge. But that's not exactly what they did. Through informal networks, they knew of some tools, some best practices that were being used by Pratham in India, including teaching at the right level, pedagogy, and the ASER citizen-led assessments that were particularly effective in helping to reach out-of-school children and bring them back to school and accelerate their learning. And so they brought those to Pakistan. But they didn't just bring some sort of document or case study, some sort of written thing. They also had support, capacity development support from Pratham. Pratham trainers coming directly to Pakistan to work with CPB to train and build capacity in the country, and to also help them adapt the programs from India to a version that would work in their local context. And this work had some substantial success. So about 83% of out-of-school children who participated in this program were successfully reintegrated into school. And 100% of the at-risk children who were still in school who participated in the program stayed in school and had their learning outcomes improved. And the story doesn't even end there. Based on the success in both India and Pakistan, the People's Action for Learning Network was created, and now that there are stakeholders in 14 countries around the world implementing similar programs, so that Baela and her team at ITA not only have benefited from knowledge exchange, but they're also contributing to it, contributing back to the work in India and contributing to the work across the 14 countries. And so this is really, I mean, it's a textbook example of what we're talking about in the integration of these three pieces. So one thing that we do in the report, which you can read, is the case studies. Another thing that we tried to do, like Liesbet mentioned, is to pull back from specific examples and also to pull from existing research and come up with a set of criteria that would describe what effective knowledge sharing in education looks like. And I won't go through all of them now. There are 14. I'll just highlight a few. You can see a page that looks like this in the report. I'll highlight a few. So the first category of criteria looks at effective knowledge sharing investments overall, and I'll point out criterion 1A. This is really the main idea of the report. Effective knowledge sharing investments integrate global public goods, capacity development, and networks. The second category, we have a set of criteria around global public goods specifically, and I'll call out criterion 2A. Impactful global public goods reflect the input of end users. This is exactly what Liesbet said. This is the blindingly obvious thing that doesn't always happen. I'll go then to criterion 3A in the capacity development section. Catalytic capacity development results from sustained rather than one-off engagement. This is to say that when you invest in a global public good and you invest in a webinar to train the world on how useful this public good is, that's probably not enough. This is about what we know about how adults learn, that adults learn when capacity development is embedded in their day-to-day work and sustained over time. And finally, I'll point out criterion 4A. This is around purposeful networks. And this is to say that networks, the networks that we're talking about are not just affinity groups of generally like-minded individuals, but rather they are individuals and organizations that share a common purpose and are working on similar problems in their own contexts. So I'll summarize. The report calls for more and better investment in knowledge sharing in education. And that means increasing the share of education funding allocated to knowledge sharing. It means better investment, which we would submit is applying the criteria that we've captured in the report. And then this final one, this is particularly for funders, embracing more flexible investment timeframes and alternate approaches to measuring impact. It is true that investments in global knowledge sharing often do not bear fruit on the same timeline as an investment in a singular intervention in a particular place. It's also true that they often require more creativity, a multiple measures approach to measuring their impact. It doesn't mean that the impact can't be measured, but it can be more difficult. But we would put forward that it's worth it. And so finally, what can you do? So we hope everybody will read the report, share it with your networks, react to it, share feedback with us, the co-authors, and you can find a link there. I'm sure it won't be hard to find that after the meeting as well. We will distribute it to everyone. We ask that you look more closely at the case studies that we've highlighted. We really think that they bring the recommendations to life. And finally, we ask that you consider your role, whether your role in the education sector is as a funder or an implementer or something else, but you would consider your role and what you and your organization can do to advance knowledge sharing in education. So with that, that's the summary of the report. I'm going to introduce now Wendy Kopp, CEO of Teach for All, who will introduce our panel.
Thank you so much, Lane, for your presentation and for BCG's incredible sustained investment in this over the last 16 months. It is really hard to imagine how this would have all come together without the incredible people they've allocated to this project and who've done just such high quality work. I'll say a couple of things to get us started, but I'm going to invite our panelists to go ahead and join while I do this. We at Teach for All have been so energized by this topic because we've seen through our own work how little investment and activity is designed to enable local leaders in education to actually learn from each other across borders. And at the same time, we've seen how much it does to accelerate progress when local leaders do have that chance. So it's been just, really energizing to be part of this process. And we're just so grateful for the chance to have been able to learn from so many stakeholders as these last months have progressed. One of my most inspiring moments and memories of the process was being here actually in this room at Asia Society at a previous convening on this topic and hearing Peter Senge from MIT, who's really known around the world for his systems change work, offer his kind of implicit endorsement and help us bring the vision to life. He was commenting on our use of the word infrastructure and said, the classic image and meaning of infrastructure is roads and highways, telephone lines and cell towers. Learning infrastructure, or what we call in this report knowledge sharing infrastructure, is analogous to that. Public investments that can actually enable learning. So I'm just really excited that with this report, we're one step closer to such a kind of global knowledge sharing infrastructure in education. So I'm excited about this panel, and we'll just briefly introduce each panelist. I'll stick here for a minute because I'm not sure about the mic situation. So first of all, Eliza Erikson is an investment partner at the Omidyar Network, where she leads the firm's global strategy and investments in education technology and oversees education investments in Latin America. Randa Grob-Zakhary represents private foundations on the board of the Global Partnership for Education and chairs its strategy committee, and is also a member of the Education Investment Committee at Porticus, where she previously led their work in education. Baela Raza Jamil is an education commissioner, as you heard, and the CEO of ITA, which is the Center for Education and Consciousness in Pakistan. And Brodie Vansleve is the Director of Education at the BHP Foundation and also directs their investments for the North America portfolio. So let me see if I can transition here. Is this still working?
Yeah, I think so.
How about that? So let me ask you to get us started, Randa, since you've been so involved in this effort over the last year. And I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to how the process, which we tried to make as inclusive and iterative as possible, has contributed to the findings themselves. And maybe just particularly interested in how you've seen this kind of advocacy effort evolve and how it relates to other things that you've been involved in as well.
Well, thank you, Wendy, and thanks to everybody for joining today. I wanted to start by, I was asked to reflect also on what this means given my previous background as a healthcare professional, and then I'll speak about the process, as you just asked. I just want to tell you I feel especially thrilled and humbled to be here because I recognized after reading this report that even though I didn't use the word education ecosystem, the lack of such a system had a lot to do with my transition away from medicine. So my first career was as a neurosurgeon with a complementary focus in neuroscience, developmental neuroscience. And it was really after, while I was pregnant, the recognition of what this deep knowledge of neuroscience means when you see the tremendous gap between what we know about children's learning and development and what is actually used everywhere. Poor and vulnerable, but also not those communities, not those situations. And so I felt a moral obligation to do whatever I could in my own way to try to close this gap. And when I changed to education, when I made that shift, even though, again, I did not use these words ecosystem, the two biggest differences I noticed compared to health was, one, the lack of knowledge in the sector. ironically, given that we're an education sector, a tremendous amount of data and a growing amount of data and investments increasing, but very little investment both with finance and with mind share, to actually translating data into knowledge for the sector. And the second significant gap was exactly these systems and infrastructures in order to systematize the sharing and have it less sporadic and opportunistic. So I'm very thrilled to see this report. It is a step along the way, but I wanted to acknowledge that this is an important part of also identifying why things have not moved ahead in education compared to health. And so that's why I was very, very happy to be part of this process from the beginning. But I do want to be transparent in saying that it had its bumps along the way. And I think that's why it is now where it is. It's very strong. It's very reflective of an inclusive process. There were some moments where some groups said, this sounds interesting, but I don't see the way we're working yet reflected there. Or there are other groups who are active in certain pockets of these activities. They're not reflected yet. And the team was not at all saying this is the way it is and sorry for you. They were very, very interested in understanding how to strengthen the participation process. So inclusiveness was one key thing. Second was adaptive, not only with who was involved, but in the purpose and meaning of the report. I don't think that you would have thought today the key elements that are there. I don't think you would have predicted those at the start, and that's a good sign that the process has been adaptive and iterative. And I think finally the last comment about the process was being integrative. And I don't just mean integral, I mean integrative, that you were very cautious, exactly following the principles of it, working with what is already there and not only adding new layers and increasing to the fragmentation. You were very cautious to build on what is there, to acknowledge and leverage the existing investments, the existing attention and actors, even if they are fragmented. That was your purpose. So if I look at that process and I look at the outcome today, I think it reflects this very earnest effort to be inclusive, adaptive, and integrative. You asked me lastly to comment on other efforts. There's no way in this few minutes here together we can do justice to all the work that many people in the room are contributing to and beyond. But given my role with the Global Partnership, you asked me to comment specifically on KICS, and I'd like to share how that aims to work on increasing quality and not only quantity of data. So KICS stands for the Knowledge and Innovation Exchange. And it is not developed yet. It is a new mechanism, a new way of working within the Global Partnership for Education, which is still in development, not the GPE, but KICS. I'll explain KICS in a moment. For those who might not be familiar with Global Partnership, let me just explain that it is an international organization which is supported by a very broad partnership globally that is committed to strengthening the national education sector planning and implementation of the poorest countries. Through that work, it reaches a very high level of systems transformation. Anyone who'd like to hear more about that afterward, please come up and feel free to discuss that. I wanted you to know that platform before I describe KICS. KICS is it has grown out of an increased desire from the developing country partners specifically. So it is locally demanded. That's a very important, significant factor in its development, to increase knowledge sharing across countries. So again, locally demanded, sharing across, and for what purpose? Specifically for the purpose of strengthening these national sector plans and implementation. So in this way, you see a heightened relevance, a heightened focus on critical issues important to the local improvement agenda, and you see also very significant, the plan, the design for it, significant increase in investment for capacity building and network strengthening. So in that way, what you are laying out is very much, it's not just in line, but complementary and enhancing the kind of principles that KICS seeks to put forward. Again, this is in development, and the timeline for this is to complete the development between now and the beginning of 2019, and to have it launched in early next year.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Randa, for all that context. Baela, as Lane presented, Chalo Parho Barho is such an incredible model for everything we're talking about. And I thought it would be good, I mean, he shared a bit more about how knowledge sharing enabled the impact in Pakistan, but I wonder if you might share more about kind of the role you then played through the People's Action for Learning Network in sharing that knowledge with other countries, and kind of what techniques were effective, what enabled that.
Thank you very much, and I once again want to thank the Asia Society and all partners, especially the Boston Consulting Group, for taking the time to put this together so effectively. And frankly speaking, it was so iterative, even I didn't know how actually it would land on its feet. So great job done. I just wanted to say, it's a real honor to be part of the making of the global ecosystem for education. No matter how many hats I wear, they all land in the same spot. Are children learning? How do we know that they are learning, and what can we do about them? And I think that it was that which has been bothering me since I was 4 years old. And so it has persisted. So the persistence was very important, and to be able to cross boundaries was very important. So in 2006, when we said in Pakistan we knew things were not right and wanted to go across and forget the politics of things, we said we know we belong to this space and we need to cross borders. It didn't take much really to find out what was happening next door in India on assessments, and that was being done through citizens that we could find out more about and to be able to replicate it if it makes sense, because the soil is the same. The people are the same. And we found that it wasn't really difficult, but it needed people to believe in it, not just Baela Raza Jamil believing in it, but many more believing in it. And amazingly, the response was great too. But there was a fear that, are we only, and there was a critic, lots of critics around, to say, are you only involved with measurement and assessment? So what? So many diagnostics have been done. Where's the action? And of course, we ourselves were concerned about where the action was. Until, we started exploring a bit more, the relationship grew. And if you can consider it as a kind of a pyramid, we were at the top end, not the most effective end, but just two people. One organization from here, one from India, bothering each other and saying, okay, what can be done? And that two went into 4 organizations because East Africa came. And then 4 went to whatever, and today we have 25 organizations who are involved in teaching at the right level, trying to understand how to adapt it to your local systems. So that said, we needed other partners too. And, good for Hewlett Foundation then believing and supporting all others, not Pakistan. But it was Pakistan who was the stirrer and said, but we never meet as a family. We don't know what each other is doing. How do we know we can do it better? We never have this transparent, face-to-face meeting. And there started the journey, triggered actually by ITA, to say, really, we want this. And we were like the outlier wanting to become an insider, and we did. And it happened concurrently where we started by 2008, we started the Asar, and by 2011, we started prodding with Chalo Padho Badho, which means let's read and grow. And that was a call for action. And I think it is the whole issue of not just giving calls for action for anything, but really a commitment to open source learning, the notion or nascent notion then of a global public good. If it works for us, why can't it work for many more? But it has to be, as described earlier very well by Lane, that it has to be very systematic. It has to have all the attributes. But with the attributes, a very important aspect is capacity building. And because without that, you just can't take something from one region and put it in another. You need to look at how to adjust to local context, but more importantly, to address many complex stakeholders who are trying to challenge you whether this will work with our SLOs, our national curriculum, our standards, our competencies. And so you're constantly having to see that alignment. Now, that alignment is important, other than what has been so eloquently described earlier in this panel, that the alignment part is important because at the end of the day, you want to have many more believers. And with the many more believers come the issue of networks that will matter. the PAL network that emerged so successfully today with almost 40 members, about 15 for the ASER, the citizen-led assessment work, which is now part of the UIS system as well, but also now 25 other partners on accelerated learning, like Chalo Paro Bado, wanting to take this forward with a lot of excitement, but a lot of responsibility. That's been a process, and a process which is, I think, getting better documented, and this particular case study makes us very conscious as a network that we need to do this documentation with granularity in terms of different geographies. And as we speak today in South Africa, there will be something happening over there also, because from this network, other networks are also emerging, which we are very proud of.
Thank you so much. I mean, I think this is just such a brilliant example of what we're talking about here and how enabling knowledge sharing across borders can drive hugely accelerated impact, and it doesn't happen in enough cases around the world. So thank you for bringing that to life.
And can I just say one? So, you know, with almost over 100,000 children reached through this accelerated learning, we've got now many more partners who are believing in it. But we felt it is the right time, because when something is working right, you need to be bold. And you need to be bold irrespective of who will do it. And so as a question of that, I mean, we felt that it is the right time to give a call for 1 million children learning and in school. Because Pakistan has 12 million children at the primary level who are out of school, but 22.8 million children of 5 to 16 years of age who are out of school. And that is an urgent emergency, which this new government has recognized.
Yeah, perfect. Eliza, we included a case study on the Omidyar Network, just given you all's approach. So while most of your investment is local, you've complemented it with some investments in the global knowledge infrastructure to accelerate the local progress. And I wonder if you can share a bit more about I guess, how your investment strategy integrates this kind of knowledge sharing with your local investments, and maybe just give us an example of your strategy.
Absolutely. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'd really like to congratulate the authors and partners on the report, really by challenging the current model of funding in education and putting forth quite a different theory of change, which I think is the right one, and kind of calling out an elephant in the room, which is the comparison of the disproportionately low investments in sort of infrastructure and knowledge sharing, which we've come to learn are essential. So I'll give maybe an example or two. The other thing I'd like to say is we're fairly early in our journey in global education, so I'm somewhat humbled to be in this group of much longer tenured sort of movement builders. So I just like to say that. But we're also quite a unique player in the philanthropic landscape in that we seek to innovate on not just what we fund, but how we fund it. From the very beginning, our founder, Pierre Omidyar, said, these entrenched problems, the philanthropic wallet is too small. Far too small to address sort of the entrenched problems, whether they're in education. We also work in financial inclusion and a variety of other areas. So let's not just bring traditional grant making to bear, but the power of markets, the power of research and development, innovation, technology. And that's not just grant making that makes that happen and grow. In fact, that's just a drop in the bucket. So we actually are one of the few that look at both for-profit and nonprofit solutions to entrenched problems, not without hiccups along the way, but really trying to innovate on the how and not just the what. And some time ago, we came to the not-so-surprising conclusion, although it seems to elude a lot of funders, that finding and funding local innovation is not enough, completely insufficient. And starting to think about investment in enabling infrastructure and the construction of kind of healthy ecosystems with good, sustainable supply and demand. And this is pretty conceptual, so I am going to go quickly into an example. And it's one I know well because it's the prong of our investment strategy that I manage in what we call equitable ed tech. And the idea is looking at technology that basically provides access and quality for low to moderate income students by supporting teachers, administrators, in a variety of areas. And in Brazil, which is an effort I manage, we started by taking the classic supply side approach. Sprinkling basically ed tech solutions, supporting them, finding the best ones with the best efficacy and equity in terms of actually addressing low to moderate income student learning outcomes, but just funding supply. The idea that would be enough, funding the innovators. And we very, very quickly realized that there were a range of demand side problems in the system. Lack of procurement channels within government for buying software. Lack of standardized curriculum for scaling technology and curriculum, lack of evidence that needed to be used by public sector buyers, and pretty common across all the kind of ecosystems we engage in. They're usually quite challenged on the demand side. And so we did two things, which I think illustrate some of the criteria in the report. One was we went local with a co-investment partnership, which I proudly think is one of the best philanthropies in education, which is the Lemon Foundation in Brazil. And basically said, we had both been taking a supply side approach and realizing this is not enough. So it said, let's join together. Let's put together a co-investment pool of very flexible capital. We don't know what we're going to do with it, but we're going to diagnose all the demand side problems, not supply side, around really heavy stuff: procurement, evidence, infrastructure, connectivity, stuff that, most people stay away from. And particularly in light of an incredible window of opportunity with the national learning standards. So Brazil's first set of national learning standards are in the process of implementation. They're called the Base Comum. And we basically said we're going to go for that side of the issue, which are long entrenched issues, and as was said, aren't going to be solved in even a matter of years. And then the other thing we looked at, which relates to knowledge sharing, is basically, let's look at a set of countries that are somewhat comparable in terms of their demographics. They're fairly middle income, but with massive inequality. Some have brought equitable ed tech to their population, say in parts of China. Others have not. So what are the key interventions? Let's really be honest about what unleashed this, and then let's perhaps bring this across a number of countries. So it doesn't just remain in Brazil locked up. And so that we're sponsoring a study around edtech ecosystems. And it particularly takes an ecosystem approach. And we sort of asked the World Bank and a bunch of people, has this ever been done? They said holistically, no. Basically, people count up the private investments, or they look at the government side. They don't look at a three-sector approach around ecosystems. And so we're going to share that. And particularly around South-South sort of knowledge sharing, what has worked. We're not going to look too much at the global North in terms of evaluating. So kind of some of the key ingredients of the approach are really starting local, not global. Sort of with robust partners that will tell you what's going on and can kind of partner with you. Then be flexible on the how, which was mentioned, the kind of support you provide, how long you demand to see results. And believe me, my board is asking me, Eliza, are you insane? How long is this going to take? I was like, I really don't know. But if we don't do it and join with others, then who? And then finally step back and consider, as I said, the harder work behind funding innovation, to really see what is necessary for systems change. So those are kind of some of the ingredients.
Great, thank you so much. So helpful to hear these specific examples. And Brodie, BHP Foundation has recently announced $52 million of investment in an education equity program over the coming few years. And you've chosen to invest in 4 initiatives that are undertaking to build pieces of the knowledge sharing infrastructure. We're very grateful that Teach for All is one of those. But I wonder if you can share a bit about what led you to focus on investing in kind of growing the knowledge sharing infrastructure.
Great. Thank you, and I'd also like to start by echoing the sentiments of the other panellists, and it's a great report, and thank you for the opportunity to participate in this conversation. I think just before I start, Wendy, I might just set some context, because for many of you in the room, you may not know who BHP is or BHP Foundation, so it's important that maybe we touch on that. We are a new organisation. We're about only a few years old, the foundation itself, but we're funded by a global leader in the resourcing sector. So BHP has been around for 130 years. It's an Australian-based company with a global footprint, and so that's an important part, I think, to the conversation, because as a new foundation, we moved into identifying that we wanted to invest in the global education challenge and agenda, but we recognised as a very new entrant, we didn't have the expertise. We didn't want to pretend we were experts in this space. So the first thing that we did was actually pause. We started with the blank canvas. We paused and we actually connected and essentially built our networks. We engaged for about 12 months, 6 to 12 months, connected with anyone and everyone that we could, asked for recommendations similar to this process, asked for people to share with us who we should contact, help us connect with others, and spent time just understanding the landscape. It was fortuitous as well. At the same time we started that process, the Learning Generation report came out, and we were very lucky to have Justin Van Fleet participate and help shape and guide us in those conversations as well. It gave us a fantastic starting place to understand and align with a global strategy or a global effort. So that started in a really good, it started us in a really good place. And then we were lucky enough to meet with the likes of Wendy and Rebecca Winthrop and Sir Kevin Collins from the UK, SUMA, about 30 different organisations to help us understand, first and foremost, what our unique offering was. We understand there's lots of people investing in education and lots of people doing a lot of great work, but what was it that we could do that would make our contribution a meaningful contribution and leverage the unique offering that we had as an organisation and as a foundation. And so if we stopped and we thought about who we were as a foundation and organisation, we have 130 years in the commercial environment landscape. We have every day we work in the space of effectiveness, efficiency, return on investment, improvement. And so how could we take that and add more value to the contribution that we wanted to make? And we also didn't want to just make a financial contribution. We understood and recognised that we had a lot more to offer than just the financial contribution. So how could we bring the expertise that we had as an organisation, the resources that we had, the influence and capacity and capability that we had, how could we bring that into the conversation as well? And so we were really lucky that we had a number of people help us shape our strategy. So from the very early stages, we actually co-developed a strategy that was relevant, that focused on the global effort and how we could, if we look at finding 3, more and better, that was it. That was at the heart and soul of what our strategy is about. How do we get better out of what we're doing already, and how do we unlock the opportunity with our partners or with the network, the purposeful network that we'd created? How do we unlock that in doing better with what we had at our disposal? Because sometimes the money is, not status quo, but what we have is what we have, but how can we get more out of that? And so we've made a really significant effort in focusing and keeping grounded in,
you're good.
In the better. How do we continue to accelerate progress by leveraging and building our network and looking at collective action. Mm-hmm. And so that hasn't been a static process. We continue to engage with the Education Commission every year. Justin's fantastic and continues to provide insight and keep us across what's going on in the global context, how it's changing. And then our network, so with Wendy and Brookings and Rebecca and UN Women and the Education Endowment Foundation, together that network is not just our small network, but the network of each of those organisations as well in helping create and share knowledge globally. And that's where our effort is focused on.
Perfect. Thank you, Brodie. Well, we had envisioned a very robust discussion that would dive into the complex details of how to actually live into this vision. But given where we are, looking at the clock and knowing how many other things people need to run with, I'm going to skip that and ask one final question that I'm hoping you'll each comment on in kind of giving us your last thoughts. So a question that we have received constantly, and I've already received several times this morning, is what comes next? And Lane offered some thoughts on that in his presentation. I think the premise of this project and of the report is that we all have to do our part if we're going to actually advance this vision. That this isn't about a single organization, it's not about a single funding campaign, it's really about all of the actors in the broader ecosystem asking themselves, what more can we do? How should the fact that having such an infrastructure would so greatly accelerate progress influence the daily choices we're making? So with that in mind, I'll just ask the panelists, from your perspective, what is the most important thing that the policymakers and donors and practitioners can do tomorrow to advance the knowledge sharing infrastructure? Who would like to start? We don't have to go in order.
Doesn't matter. I'll start.
Yeah.
And I'd like to speak to private philanthropies as our peers. And it comes straight from what I was saying before. I think there's this preference, I think, to think about your donations in isolation from everything else that's going on, which is really a pity and sounds bizarre, but it is the case. And sort of, I would say to other funders, think about the environment in which you're funding. There's such a predilection for, investing in operators, in isolation. But think about the connective tissue around you, because if that's a disabling environment, not only is your project not going to succeed, the systems change you aspire to is never going to succeed. And I understand it's, often people say to us, well, you guys have the luxury of like the entire toolkit. And I it's a great privilege, and I know it's not often replicable or scalable, but think about what you can do within the environment rather than funding individual innovation, because I can guarantee you that your individual innovation is not going to make much impact unless you think about the context around it. So it's just really shifting a mind frame and a mindset for investment and funding, and that's what I would suggest people do.
So the call for, I think, global public goods has been made successfully, and I'm so honored that being a commissioner in the Education Commission, the Learning Generation said it. Global Education Monitoring Report said it again, and now we have this report. Now, the question is, again, to be asked for funders, for government, for many stakeholders, are we really investing it right? Keeping in mind the impact that has been shown from what are seen in the criteria of the global public goods. Are we investing with the right partners and networks, really, that are so critical, that are out there, and I think have a mark, and the footprint, can be seen that it is evolving and is likely to expand with those kind of partnerships. And the third aspect is that how do we know that it is right? How do we know whether we are iteratively measuring, refining? Because whatever the innovation is, its great robustness is only when it grows and evolves. And do we see those aspects in that evolution of that innovation, whether it is really growing, whether it is taking advantage not just of the local traditional, which is very critical, the oral, but also of new technologies which really make things go leapfrog. And the kind of work that we are all looking for is, how do we ramp up? How do we look at scale? Because without that, really, we've not got it right. And really, the time is running out. So I think those are like three big things. And even if, like we've made this call for 1 million out-of-school children learning and in school, it is important to be able to be ambitious, to have those calls, and to think in terms of partnerships for making that happen. It's not about one actor.
I think from a funder's perspective, I know in our experience, a lot of effort and a lot of time is put into resources into evaluation, but I would also ask and suggest that when we look at designing our programs and our projects, and for the implementing partners as well to start pushing forward in this as well, is to set up space, resources, money, financing this up front in our designs to have the space to do this, because it will take time for that shift and for people to start to get for us to get comfortable that this is critically important, just like evaluation and just like measuring what we're doing up front. I think that's the one thing we can do.
If I come back to the comparison with healthcare, one thing I didn't mention in the interest of time was a cultural difference, and it's in medicine, this embedded value of continuous improvement. That you start from the best practices, and it would be morally reprehensible if a physician proposed to treat you based on old, outdated knowledge. So with that, when you ask what's next, I would challenge each of us, whatever kind of organization we're in, to make the commitment for best practices, good practices being the starting point of our work and not the end product. Do we know what's come before? Do we understand what's failed, what's succeeded, and why? Are we protecting and committing the right level of funding, not for a report at the end, but really for the activities that both strengthen the systems we're talking about needing, but also help that knowledge get into the hands of who can best use it? And I think in that way, if we make this moral commitment to continuous improvement as a group, we can make strides in helping the recommendations to actually have traction.
Well, thank you so much for all those thoughts. And I know that's a discussion we're hoping will continue, and we're looking forward to hearing really from all of you with your thoughts about what should come next. Thank you so much to our wonderful panelists. And I'll now introduce Amel Karboul, who, as you know, is an education commissioner and is the CEO of the Education Outcomes Fund for Africa and the Middle East, and who has been really deeply involved in this effort over the last many months. So I'll ask you to join us, and we can talk through this.
Yeah, thank you very much, everyone. I know I'm standing between you and your next UNGA meeting, so I'm going to try be very, very brief. As a personal reflection, I have to say I've been quite tough to the team here over the months and kind of always asking at the beginning. I didn't get it. I didn't get it for months and months, and I was like, what is this? Is this an institution? Is this an advocacy effort? What is this? What is this? And what was great is that the team embraced the complexity of it, did listen every time, and every time the next iteration I felt like was better than the one before, and the result is great, and the result is something I would have never expected to happen. So it's been like a privilege to be part of knowledge creation, embracing complexity and all the challenges from everyone, and taking them. Because one thing that I think, so the process of this report is actually a mirror of our education ecosystem. Because on one side, we are very strong in our diversity. There are hundreds and thousands of organizations and people out there who care about children learning and work for it. But the strength can also be overused. I had the chance like a few years ago to do a 360-degree leadership feedback. And normally they focus on strengths and weaknesses, or more politically correct, areas of development. But we use a tool called LVI, and that has something unique, which was called strengths overused. So that actually sometimes your strength can be overused and become a weakness. And I think in the education ecosystem, we may have overused sometimes our diversity to become fragmented, to become very territorial, and sometimes more like shooting at each other's progress than actually accepting that what we're trying to do sometimes is imperfect. And that we have to embrace these imperfect projects. And whoever stands up and tries to do something to support them with all the imperfection, and even if they don't match our own agenda to 100%, but keeping that bigger goal in mind of children learning. So I was supposed to do kind of an interactive session, and I think I have to push it to the small time we have at reception. I would like to reiterate Liesbet's message that actually the work does not end here, the work starts here. In all honesty, I was tempted to think, have we failed? Have we failed not to be able out of this work to have a big check of someone writing it to create an organization like CGIAR or GLN for health? But Wendy and her constant optimism, I'm driven by dissatisfaction. She's driven by optimism. So we are a good team. She's like, no, we haven't failed. This is maybe the foundation for us to be able to go out there, all of us, with a common, agenda about, public goods, network and capacity building, and have a better language maybe to get that funding for one day, to have such an institution that can support all of us. So I invite you to think about your role, your organization and your work in two areas. One is helping us to keep this momentum, helping us to keep the ecosystem in mind and see how can we support it, but also like in your own funding and your own programs. And we have taken this as EOF as a homework now to do to take this model as a key model for our knowledge sharing and push the diversity that we found. The answer will probably never be a single entity, especially if you look at all the other SDGs. I was privileged yesterday to be invited by the Rockefeller Foundation to take part in the 17 rooms, and few people are here who were with us yesterday. And interestingly, like at the end of the conversation where, 17 SDGs have been discussing about how can we move the needle the next year and what could be prominent, almost everyone, I think with the exception of climate change, said like, okay, we are not in the global discussion. Global leaders are not talking about us. So I left the meeting thinking like, if global leaders don't talk about the 17 SDGs, what are they actually talking about? But that's, that's something else. But there was a sense in our education room, sometimes a bit of hopelessness, and that global leaders sometimes don't embrace education in the global agenda and like to leave it as a kind of a national or regional problem, because maybe we don't believe it's doable enough. Maybe we don't know how is it doable enough. So I think one big message that this can help us bring, yes, the learning crisis is massive. Half of the world children may be failing to learn, but it is doable. And I think doable not in terms of asking all the other SDGs to help us, to invest in us, but doable in terms of showing them that without education they won't achieve their goals. Take climate change, and we've discussed this yesterday. If we wanted to achieve climate change goals, we have to educate everyone about climate change. If you want to educate everyone about climate change, you need a curriculum, you need teachers, you need an ecosystem, you need all these kind of things. So engaging the other SDGs also, broadening this and not telling them help us, but telling them, hey, how can we help you? And by that, engaging them to be part of this ecosystem. So thank you, everyone. I know this week is going to be crazy insane for all of us. Definitely, I mean, my first speaking this afternoon at Brookings, I'm going to take the report and make a lot of advertisement for it. And I hope every one of us will do a lot of this week. And I hope that at the reception, you will not only catch up with friends, but have the conversation of how can our organization drive this agenda forward. Thank you very much.